It happened so fast. 1 second, I was squeezing past the crowded dinner table, balancing a dish of mashed potatoes in one hand. The next, her palm cracked across my cheek. The slap wasn't just a sound, it was a shockwave. My skin burned from the sting, but the achy of humiliation cut deeper. The room fell silent, every clink of silverware and hum of conversation vanishing in an instant. All eyes were on me and her Sable, my sister-in-law, standing there with her hand still raised as if daring me to retaliate. I froze. My body didn't know whether to fight, flee, or collapse under the weight of her stare. My chest tightened as my brain scrambled for answers. What had I done? It wasn't deliberate, I swear it wasn't. I'd brushed against her shoulder as I passed by, my only crime being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I'm sorry, I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. But Sable's glare cut through me like a blade. Her lips curled into a smug smile, and she simply said, "Watch yourself." The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. My mom looked horrified, her hand halfway to her mouth. My dad sat frozen, gripping his glass of wine as if it might shatter. And then there was my brother, Merrick, my rock, my confidant. He sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his gaze fixed on the table as if looking at me might break him. Not a single person spoke up. Not a single voice came to my defense. I stood there, my cheek flaming, my mind reeling. How could something so small, so innocent explode into this? But deep down, I knew. This slap wasn't just about tonight. It wasn't about a bump or a passing touch. It was about something bigger, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. Little did I know, this moment was just the beginning. What had been a quiet tension between Sable and me was about to erupt into something far darker and far more destructive than I ever could have imagined. I'm Lyra, the youngest of 3 siblings and, as my family often reminded me, the quiet one. Growing up, I wasn't the loudest or the boldest, but I tried to be the glue that held everyone together. I was the peacemaker, the one who would smooth over disagreements and make sure everyone left the room smiling. Merrick, my older brother, was my hero. He was my protector, my confidant, and my partner in crime. If I got in trouble for sneaking an extra cookie, Merrick would sneak too and say it was all his idea. We were inseparable, and no matter what life threw at us, I always knew he had my back. When Merrick met Sable, I thought she was a dream come true for him. She was stunning, with piercing blue eyes and an air of confidence that could command a room. She was smart, charming, and unapologetically bold, everything I wasn't. I remember the first time I met her. She had this effortless way of drawing people in, making everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. I thought to myself, Merrick's lucky to have her. I wanted to like her because Merrick adored her. He was smitten, and his happiness meant everything to me. But as time went on, the admiration I felt for Sable began to fade. It started with little things that felt harmless on the surface but left me uneasy. At a family barbecue, she turned to me and said, "You're so quiet, Lyra. I can't tell if you're shy or if you just don't like people." She laughed, and everyone else chuckled along, but I felt a knot tighten in my chest. Was it a joke? Or was it something else? I brushed it off. She didn't mean anything by it, right? But the comments didn't stop. When I showed up to dinner in a dress I had spent weeks saving up for, she glanced at me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Oh, that's an interesting choice." When I tried to share an idea or opinion during conversations, she'd cut me off with a dismissive, "Actually, that's not how it works," and proceed to explain why she was right. No one else seemed to notice. Merrick, blinded by love, would laugh and pull her closer as if her cutting words were just part of her charm. My parents adored her. To them, she was everything they had ever dreamed of for their golden boy. But to me, Sable was a storm cloud, growing darker and more oppressive with each passing day. Family gatherings became a source of anxiety. I would spend hours agonizing over what to wear, what to say, and how to avoid drawing Sable's attention. The tension was suffocating, but I kept telling myself it was my problem. I just needed to toughen up, to not take things so personally. But deep down, I knew there was something deeper brewing beneath her polished exterior. Merrick and I started to drift apart. He was so wrapped up in his new life with Sable that our once unshakable bond began to fray. Conversations that used to flow so easily now felt strained, as if there was an invisible wall between us. Still, I held on to hope that things would improve. I told myself that if I just tried harder, if I gave Sable more of a chance, maybe we could find common ground. But no amount of effort could prepare me for what happened that night at the dinner table. The slap wasn't just the culmination of months of tension, it was a breaking point. The moment when everything I had tried to ignore came crashing down. As I stood there, reeling from the sting on my cheek and the weight of a room full of staring eyes, I realized something. This wasn't just about me. This was about something much bigger, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. I had spent my whole life trying to keep the peace, But now I had to decide if I was willing to fight for myself for Merrick, and for the truth that Sable had worked so hard to keep hidden. The tension between Sable and me wasn't an overnight thing. It grew slowly, creeping into family events, phone calls, and even casual conversations. I wanted to believe she was just teasing, that I was overreacting. But the more time passed, the harder it became to ignore the venom behind her words. One Thanksgiving, the whole family was crowded around the dining table, savoring the warm, comforting aroma of my mom's famous peing pie. Compliments filled the air, and everyone showered my mom with well-deserved praise. That's when Sable leaned over and whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "Maybe you should ask for the recipe. You could use some help in the kitchen." Her words hit me like a dart. Cooking was my passion, it was the one thing I prided myself on. Everyone knew that. And yet, she managed to twist it into something I should feel inadequate about. I forced a tight smile, pretending her comment didn't bother me. But the truth? It stung. A lot. The worst part wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. She had this way of making everything sound lighthearted and innocent, but her tone was always just sharp enough to cut. If I called her out, I'd look oversensitive, and she'd have the perfect excuse to turn the tables. But her jabs didn't stop with me. Sable's charm was a mask, one she wore so convincingly that most people didn't notice the cracks beneath it. She'd shower compliments on my mom while slipping in backhanded remarks about how outdated her decor was. She'd offer to help in the kitchen but make snide comments about how the utensils weren't exactly professional grade. Yet no one seemed to see it, not even Merrick. He was so in love with her, so blinded by her magnetic personality, that he missed the way she chipped away at everyone around her. Or maybe he saw it and didn't want to admit it. Either way, I felt like I was standing on an island, completely alone. For years, I tried to keep the peace. I bit my tongue, smiled through the insults, and told myself it wasn't worth causing a scene. But every family gathering felt heavier, like walking into a room filled with invisible landmines, never knowing when one would explode. And then came the night of the family dinner. It was supposed to be a peaceful evening. My mom had spent hours in the kitchen preparing a feast, and I arrived early to help set the table. The air smelled like roasted chicken, fresh herbs, and the cinnamon rolls I had baked too. For once, I hoped the night would be uneventful. But as soon as Sable walked in, I could feel it, her eyes on me, sharp and probing, like she was waiting for a moment to strike. She greeted everyone with her usual grace, showering my parents with compliments about the house, their cooking, and even their garden. But when she turned to me, her smile felt more like a smirk. "Lyra, you brought rolls? How sweet. Did you bake them yourself or?" Her voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. I let it slide, refusing to let her ruin the evening. The table was crowded, everyone laughing and sharing stories, and for a while it felt almost normal. I started to relax, convincing myself that maybe tonight would be different. But Sable doesn't let things go. As I reached across the table for the breadbasket, I accidentally brushed against her shoulder. It was nothing, a simple, harmless touch. I immediately said, "Oh, sorry," and started to pull back. But Sable's expression changed in an instant. Her face twisted into a mask of indignation, and before I could react, she stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You're so careless, Lyra," she snapped, loud enough for the whole table to hear. I froze, stunned. "It was an accident," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She took a step closer, her eyes burning with anger. "You're always in the way, aren't you? Always so clumsy, so." And then it happened. Her hand flew up, and before I could process what was happening, her palm connected with my cheek. The sound of the slap rang out, silencing the entire room. I stood there, stunned, my cheek burning as tears welled up in my eyes. My mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. My dad looked like he wanted to intervene but didn't know how. And Merrick? He just sat there, staring at the table, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck stood out. The silence stretched on, suffocating and unbearable. Finally, Sable broke it, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Oh, I'm sorry. Did that hurt?" She didn't mean it. Her tone was mocking, her words a cruel twist of the knife. I wanted to scream, to yell, to do something. But I couldn't. My body felt frozen, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts and emotions I couldn't untangle. This wasn't just about tonight. It wasn't about a bump or a brush on the shoulder. This was years of resentment, years of tension boiling over in one explosive moment. As I stood there, reeling from the slap and the weight of everyone's silence, one thought kept echoing in my mind: something has to change. After the slap, I excused myself to the bathroom, my steps quick but unsteady. My heart pounded as I closed the door behind me and locked it. My hands trembled as I gripped the edge of the sink, the cold porcelain grounding me just enough to keep the tears at bay. Looking into the mirror, I saw the faint red mark still glowing on my cheek. It wasn't the physical pain that cut the deepest, it was the humiliation, the powerlessness, and the question gnawing at me, why does Sable hate me so much? I took a deep breath and splashed cold water on my face. You won't cry, I whispered to myself. You can't let her win. That night, after everyone had left and the house was quiet, I sat on my bed, replaying the evening in my head. Sable's glare, her sharp words, the slap, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite put together. There had to be more to this than just clumsily bumping into her. The next day, I met up with Zan, my best friend and the one person I could always count on. We sat in our favorite cafe, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods wrapping around us like a comfort blanket. I recounted everything to him, my voice low but heavy with frustration. Why does she hate me, Zan? What did I ever do to her? Zan leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed as he considered my words. It's not you, Lyra. It's her. There's something about her energy, something controlling. Have you noticed how Merrick's changed since they got together? I nodded. Merrick, who used to be so warm and open, had become more distant, especially with me. Maybe, Zan said carefully, you should look into her past. See if there's a pattern. I hesitated. You mean, Snoop, call it research, he said with a shrug. You deserve to understand what you're dealing with. At first I resisted the idea. It felt invasive and wrong. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't just sit by and let Sable steamroll my family. If there was something to uncover, I needed to know, so I started digging. What I found was alarming. Sable had a history of strained relationships, not just romantic ones, but with friends and family too. I stumbled across old social media posts from people who seemed to hint at her manipulative tendencies. Comments like, "Be careful who you trust, some people thrive on tearing others down," felt eerily familiar. Then I found something concrete, a restraining order filed by an ex-fiancé years ago. The details were murky, but the accusations of emotional abuse and isolation were chilling. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to take shape. Sable wasn't just hostile to me. She had a pattern of alienating people, cutting them off from their loved ones, and asserting control. And Merrick? He was her latest target. It was like a fog had lifted. All the small jabs, the veiled insults, the constant need to one-up me, they weren't random. They were part of a calculated effort to push me out of Merrick's life. The realization left me shaken but also resolute. Sable wasn't just my problem. She was a threat to my entire family and especially to my brother. I had spent so long staying silent, trying to keep the peace. But now, I knew silence wasn't an option anymore. The tension in the air was palpable at the next family gathering. Every glance, every forced smile felt like the calm before a storm. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind 100 times, yet my heart pounded as the dinner plates were cleared and conversations began to die down. I stood up, my hands trembling slightly but my resolve firm. Sable, I said, locking eyes with her. Can we talk for a moment? The room fell silent, heads turning to watch the two of us. Sable's eyes narrowed, her expression a mixture of suspicion and annoyance. After a beat, she pushed back her chair and followed me into the kitchen. As the door swung shut behind us, I turned to face her. My voice was steady, though my chest felt tight. Why do you treat me like this? She folded her arms, leaning against the counter with that familiar smirk. Oh, here we go, she said, her tone dripping with condescension. Lyra, you're too sensitive. Not everything's about you, you know. Maybe you should grow a thicker skin. Her words stung. But this time, I didn't back down. I took a step closer, meeting her gaze head on. This isn't about being sensitive, Sable. It's about you trying to tear me down. And it's not just me, you've done this to others too. I know about your past. Her smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of something I hadn't seen before, fear. She straightened, her eyes narrowing further as if trying to gauge how much I knew. You don't know anything, she said sharply, her voice rising in pitch. I know enough, I replied, my voice unwavering. I know how you isolate people, how you manipulate them to stay in control. And I'm not going to let you do that to Merrick or this family. Her composure cracked. You're lying, she hissed, stepping closer, her voice now shaking with anger. I'm not, I said calmly. And whether you admit it or not, you know I'm telling the truth. Her face twisted with fury, and before I could react, her hand shot out, delivering another slap. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. But this time, I didn't flinch. I stood my ground, staring into her eyes with all the strength I could muster. My cheek stung, but I refused to show weakness. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Sable's breathing was ragged, her expression wild, but I didn't budge. Finally, she let out a frustrated scream and stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind her. I stayed where I was, my heart racing but my resolve unshaken. I had stood up to her. For the first time, I had fought back and I wasn't going to stop. In the weeks that followed, the family dinners felt different. The usual warmth had been replaced with tension, As everyone began to notice what I had endured for years, Sable's carefully constructed facade of charm and confidence started to crumble. She couldn't hide her true nature anymore. Her sharp comments, once disguised as jokes, were now scrutinized. The family began to pick up on the condescension in her tone and the passive-aggressive remarks she couldn't seem to resist. The tipping point came during a Sunday brunch when Sable snapped at my mom for something trivial. Merrick, who had always brushed off her behavior, finally spoke up. "Why do you talk to people like that, Sable?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. The room fell silent. Sable froze, her expression a mix of shock and indignation. "What are you talking about?" she stammered. Merrick didn't back down. "I've been ignoring it for too long, but Lyra's right. You put others down to make yourself feel better, and it's not okay. It stops now." I'll never forget the look on her face, a mix of anger and realization that her grip on him was loosening. Sable stormed out that day, and though she tried to repair the damage, it was clear Merrick was no longer willing to turn a blind eye. Their relationship began to unravel, and within a few months, Sable moved out. It was painful for Merrick, but he later admitted it was for the best. As for me, the experience left scars, emotional ones that took time to heal. But it also gave me a strength I didn't know I had. Standing up to Sable wasn't just about confronting her, it was about confronting the part of me that always stayed silent to keep the peace. It was about learning that my voice mattered, even when it felt easier to stay quiet. In the aftermath, I found myself reflecting on the lessons I had learned. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones fought within our own families. They're messy and painful, but they also have the power to reveal who we are and what we're capable of. I began to notice a change in myself. I started setting boundaries, not just with Sable but with everyone in my life. I no longer tolerated behavior that made me feel small, and in doing so, I discovered a newfound sense of peace. Merrick and I grew close again, slowly rebuilding the bond we had before Sable came into our lives. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Looking back, I can see that Sable's presence, as painful as it was, taught me some of the most important lessons of my life. She showed me the importance of standing up for myself, the value of speaking out against injustice, and the strength it takes to protect what matters most. As I sit here now, recounting this story, I feel a sense of closure. That chapter of my life was one of the hardest I've ever faced, but it shaped me into the person I am today. Life isn't always fair, and sometimes the people we expect to bring us happiness bring us pain instead. But every challenge, every heartbreak, carries a lesson. And for me, that lesson was clear even in the face of conflict. Never let anyone dim your light. Stand tall, speak your truth, and trust in your strength.